it's looking like we won't get through everything in Proverbs this quarter, so we may extend this study into the next quarter or the summer quarter. However, we'll change it. It won't be on the Sunday morning docket. It'll be on the Wednesday evening docket. So we should be finished with Ecclesiastes, and we can transfer our study on Proverbs to Wednesday night. So I'll just give you a little kind of a commercial unless things change here in the near future, but that's where we're going according to what it looks like. Been trying, as we study Proverbs, to pick out different aspects of life that Proverbs addresses and talk about those one-on-one. And this morning we'll talk about what Proverbs says, some of the things Proverbs says about finances in one way or another. So let's start in chapter 13. Some of the things it says are encouragements to do things one way or another, and other things Proverbs teaches us are warnings about doing it the wrong way. But here we are in chapter 13. Let's start at verse 21. And here's what I'd like to do. Instead of you listening to my voice all the time, I'd like to have some volunteer readers. In a couple of these sections, we'll have 2 or 3 brief verses. But here's one. It'll be 21 to 25. I'd like somebody to read that, please. Anybody? Proverbs 13, 21 to 25. Now, most people, I'm pretty sure in here, know how to read. So this shouldn't take too long. All right, Bobby.
Adversity pursues sinners, but the righteous will be rewarded with posterity. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. Abundant food is in the fallow ground of the poor, but it is swept away by injustice. He who withholds his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him diligently. The righteous has enough to satisfy his appetite, but the stomach of the wicked is in need.
Thank you, Bobby. And actually, I don't know that in the context it all stops right there. I sort of think it goes on into chapter 14, verse 1, where it talks about the wise woman building her house. But that's another study. Not another study, but another aspect of this. But we'll deal with 21 through 25 first of all. What pursues sinners according to this passage? Adversity. We know what adversity is. That's when things do not go well. So if you want things to go poorly in your life, involve yourself in sin. And if you involve yourself in sin, adversity will pursue you. I don't know if any of you have had the dreams that some people have, but they dream about things chasing them. You ever had one of those dreams? It's okay to admit to it in here, because I'm not going to say, aha, you're one of those who, you're a sinner, and that's adversity pursuing you. But it's a scary dream when something is chasing you and you can't get away from it. And Solomon is telling us that the reality of life is that if we involve ourselves in sin, that adversity is going to pursue us. On the contrary to that, the righteous will be rewarded with prosperity. So if we pursue righteousness, we will be pursued by prosperity, is almost what it's saying. Prosperity is going to chase you down, run you over. How many of you want to be run over by prosperity? Sounds good to me. I'd like some of those tire tracks up my back. And we've got them. If we look into our lives, we can see the different ways that we have prospered. Now, we're talking about what Proverbs says about finances, but is there any other way to prosper besides with money? Ask somebody who does not have their health. Ask someone who's struggling with family problems. Now, all of us are going to have some degree of financial trouble, family trouble, health problems. We're going to have it to one degree or another. But I believe what Solomon is telling us, or what God's telling us through Solomon, is that we can make some adjustments and we can ease the burden that all of us bear in every aspect of life if we pursue righteousness rather than sin. Sin just makes everything worse. Righteousness, on the other hand, makes everything better. Righteousness doesn't mean that we will be without problems and troubles, but it definitely means that we're going in God's direction, and so he's going to come towards us. Isn't that what James says? Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Good men leave inheritances to their children's children, but sinners have wealth that is stored up for the righteous. Now, is that absolutely true in every case? Have you ever known a sinner who passed his wealth on to somebody who was a sinner too? Now that does happen. But generally speaking, this is how God makes it work. This is his design to make it work. And in the long term, this is how it comes out. Also remember that you can inherit things from your parents besides money. You can inherit wealth that money won't buy. And probably all of us here can testify to that there's some degree of wealth we have inherited from our parents that money cannot buy. And I think he's going to get back into that in just a minute. But then he says this in verse 23, abundant food is in the fallow ground of the poor, but it's swept away by injustice. What is fallow ground? What does it mean to have ground lie fallow? Okay, it won't grow anything. It's resting. Okay, that's the idea. If it's fallow, you can let your ground lie fallow. And as a matter of fact, they've determined, and I remember studying this, was it social studies or history? You don't know, do you? Because I'm going through my own little mind. But I remember in school, and I hadn't thought about it until just now, crop rotation was one of the things I remember learning in grade school, that ancient Americans, we're 200 years old as a country, and I'm talking about ancient Americans. But previous Americans who grew crops in Virginia and the Carolinas, particularly as I remember what I was taught, learned that if you just grow the same crop on the same ground year after year after year, you wear the ground out. But if you will let it lie fallow, it will regenerate its nutrition value, and you can grow another crop the next year, and it'll be just fine. You know that's in the Bible? Every 7th year, stop growing anything. Let your ground rest, and then come back the next year, and you'll have a new piece of ground to start with. So Solomon is telling us here that abundant food is in the ground of the poor, even though they're not cultivating that ground. The potential is there. Don't you like that idea that everybody has potential? And I think that's what Solomon's saying here. Abundant food is in the fallow ground, the resting ground of the poor. In other words, if they put that ground to work, it would produce. And I think there are more applications to this than just in agriculture. There are a lot of ways that we have fallow ground in our lives. We might not be seeking as much education as we should get, or as much training in certain things as we should get. Do you know people, and you talk with them every day, and you think, I wish they would study their Bible more. It might change their life. Well, maybe they're allowing their spiritual side to lie fallow. That's another issue, but at least that's what I'm seeing in this. Then verse 24. And we might read verse 24 and wonder, how in the world does this have anything to do with the context of finances? But remember, back in verse 22, it talked about passing on an inheritance to your children. Do you think verse 24 has anything to do with passing something on to your children? What's that?
Isn't verse 22 your grandchildren?
Yes. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. In other words, it's not just to the grandchildren, but it's such a great inheritance that you're passing on. It goes to your children, and then it goes on down to your grandchildren. That's what I'm saying in verse 22. So in verse 24, he's talking about what we pass on that's not just finances. It's really more valuable than finances. We pass on discipline. And if you've ever been to Walmart, you know where I'm going with this, don't you?
Yeah.
You know the value of disciplined children. And if you know any of the adults who were those kids at Walmart, you know how valuable it is. Because it's not like, well, we won't discipline them now. They'll learn discipline when they're adults. No, those are the people that our jails are filled up with. Discipline is what God is saying through Solomon we need to give our children when they are young. He who loves his child disciplines him diligently. And if we're talking about prosperity and wealth, what's a greater source of prosperity and wealth than your own children? Is there any greater blessing from God than that? And so why squander your physical money and think, oh, that's a horrendous tragedy, and then squander your child because you lack giving them discipline and think that's not a worse tragedy? Is this making any sense? Am I talking? Are you seeing any connection between these? Okay. Nobody said anything, so we'll just continue. The righteous has enough to satisfy his appetite, but the stomach of the wicked is in need. More of the idea, live right in the eyes of God, and he's going to take care of you. Forsake God, and you are treading on dangerous ground. Any comments, observations about this text before we move on to the next one? Okay, let's go to chapter 27. Going to need a reader for this. Verses 23 to 27. Who will read this text for us? Okay, PJ. Proverbs 27, 23 to 27.
Know well the condition of your flocks and pay attention to your herds, for riches are not forever, nor does a crown endure to all generations. When the grass disappears, the new growth is seen, and the herbs of the mountains are gathered in. The lambs will be for your clothing, and the goats will bring the price of the field. And there will be goat's milk enough for your food, and for the food of your household, and sustenance for your maidens.
All right, is Solomon teaching materialism here?
Teaching responsibility.
He's teaching responsibility. Responsibility for what?
Know the condition of your ground and things that you're doing.
If God gives us a material blessing, do we not have some degree of responsibility to care for that blessing and be we don't use the word much anymore, a steward. But a steward is somebody who is responsible for something. And if God gives us something, then we become responsible for that, to care for that, to use it. Remember the parable of we call it the parable of the talents because the word talent meant an amount of money. But it's really a parable about the money. God gave money to 3 of his servants. And the first 2 took what God gave them, used it so well that they increased and doubled what they had. And what did the third one do? He hid his money in the ground, and that's all he had to give the master when he came back. So Solomon is saying here, if you've got flocks, hey, know the condition of your flocks. Pay attention to your herds. Riches are not forever. They are fleeting. All of us know that. So pay attention to what God has given you. Even a crown does not endure to all generations. When the grass disappears, the new growth is seen. And what happens next? The herbs of the mountains are gathered. 2 things I see in this. Number 1, God has provided in our universe a continuing resource of use and renewal. You've probably seen places or know about places where there's been a horrible fire and great tracts of forest land have been burned up, and then the next year there's new growth. And stuff starts to come back, and forests that were burned away are regrown again. What about herbs? Have you ever harvested herbs? Are they out there? Sure they're out there. Do you know you can make a wonderful salad out of dandelions? And some of you are thinking, I can't wait to get in my backyard now. Now don't eat the ones that have been sprayed. But dandelions are great food. So is chicory. You can even make coffee out of the roots, dried roots of chicory. Sassafras trees, saplings, dig up those roots, dry it out, make sassafras tea. It's marvelous. You know it takes work to gather herbs, because we're not talking about big, huge plants. It takes work. Talk about those molly moochers. You get out in the woods and look for molly moochers, I call them. They're morel mushrooms. And the season has just passed. But you could go out and search for those things and find them. You don't find them in great big heaps. You find them in little bunches. And you gather up what you can, where you can. Ginseng. A lot of guys hunt ginseng. Anybody ever heard of ginseng? Okay. It's a medicinal herb, good for food. Go into Walmart and you'll find it in a bottle, in a pill, and it's expensive. Takes some effort, takes some work. but it's out there. God's made this stuff. And we might wonder, why did he make it so small? Well, maybe he made it small so we will learn a lesson in value. So that as we look for those small things that add great value to life, we will know you got to put forth some effort. You got to take some time. And there's some things you have to learn, but it's all worthwhile. How would you like to eat food without any seasoning? Because all of our seasonings are herbs. What would happen if all of a sudden there wasn't any more oregano?
The food would taste like what Dave's been having the last few
Oh, bless his heart. We're going to take him a pizza. But, we talk about the spice of life. That's what these herbs are talking about, and we're being taught here. The herbs are coming, but you've got to gather them. The lambs, what are they for? Clothing. What do you do with goats? Turn them into cash so you can buy a field. Is there anything wrong with buying a field, buying property? Oh, that's materialistic. Well, no. You're using what God has given you to increase your wealth, with the assumption that you will use your wealth in a godly fashion. How wealthy are we allowed to be in Christ? You allowed to have $1 million? Only if it's liquid. That means you can sell it off. There's no limit. God doesn't say you have to be this poor or you can be this rich. He just says, here's what I want to give you. Use it well, use it wisely, and I'll bless that with increase. Yes. Hey, here comes Nick. Check it out. Welcome back. How's the leg? It's there. Well, I hope it's getting better.
Marty, I was going to just mention that periodically on TV we see the abused animals
Yes.
where they have either with cats, dogs, horses, they're just starving to death. The interesting thing is when you get the background to all the people that related to those animals, the people have their own psychological, mental, some type of problems, or that wouldn't have happened to their animals. So there's some relationship between how they prosper and how people are responding morally and ethically to responsibility.
Yes. And that's a very clear picture, because I know all of us in our mind's eye can see the pictures of those animals, whether they're horses or donkeys, cattle, dogs, and cats. We can see those in our mind's eye. There's a spiritual side to that as well. We're in Proverbs chapter 27, by the way. Last part of chapter 27, verses 23 to 27. It's going to be goat's milk enough for your food and the food of your household and sustenance for your maidens. I take a lot of comfort in this because it just simply tells us, it shows us, God's given you blessings and you're supposed to enjoy those blessings, which, is that what we're learning in Ecclesiastes? There's nothing better for a man than to enjoy the fruit of his labor. That's what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes over and over and over, and he keeps coming back to that. And all the things that are empty and vain, here's one thing that's good, that a man enjoy the fruit of his labor. And this is what Solomon's talking about here as well. If God gives it to you, it's good. Use it. Enjoy it. Isn't it frustrating, at least a frustrating thought if it's never happened to you, that you would give someone a present that you know they really want, and they say, this is just so wonderful, I just can't accept it. Well, why did you give it to them? Because you wanted them to accept it. You wanted them to enjoy it. But for whatever reason, they just, I don't deserve this. Well, it's not about whether you deserve it or not. I want you to have it. I want you to see you use it. I want you to see you enjoy it. If you were God, and you had all the resources of, well, you got all resources. There's no limit. Wouldn't you want to give your children good things and see them enjoy those good things? We do that as parents. You wouldn't have a party for your 6-year-old and they look at all the gifts and say, I don't deserve this. I'm going to go to my room. You said, right. What universe are you in, Marty? But you would know, oh, my child's got some psychological problems. No, God wants us to enjoy the good things he gives us. So don't feel bad about doing that at all. All right, let's go to chapter 28, verse 20. This is just one verse. Who will read it for us?
Marty,
Billy will.
before you leave on that last part.
All right. Yes.
It says you'll have enough for you. You'll provide for you. You'll also be able to provide for your household and for your maidens. If you know the progress from here, God's provided for us, so we can provide for our family and for others.
That's a good point.
You know, and what should we do? What should we do with that which God has provided for us? We should glorify Him for providing for us and use it liberally and not sparingly to others also, that it may glorify God.
That's right. And you see the connection? Your household, your maidens, and then we go back to that other passage we just read where you leave an inheritance not just to your children, but to your children's children. If we accept that God has blessed us and use his wealth well, that's the potential to pass on an inheritance. And remember, we're not just talking about material things. That's the subject and that's the context. But there are so many wonderful ways to pass on an inheritance down the line. All right, chapter 28, verse 20. Who's going to read it? Okay.
A faithful man will abound with blessings, but he who hastens to be rich will not go unpunished.
A faithful man will abound in blessings. What is required to be faithful? And this is almost kind of a trick question. But what's required to be faithful?
You must have faith.
What's that?
You must have faith first.
You must have faith first. Yes, this is true.
We'll live faithfully.
Do what?
You have to live.
You have to live faithful. What's required to live faithfully? What's that? Emotion? Okay. Oh, devotion. Yes, I'm glad you said devotion instead of emotion. Because I fully agree with devotion. Yeah.
Trust.
Trust. Obedience. Mike?
Apply God's word to your life.
I'm sorry?
Apply God's word to your life.
Yes, apply God's word to your life. Now here's where I'm going with this, and it's obvious that it is kind of a trick question, but I don't mean it to be trick because it's in the text. Time. Time. Your life has to be tested by time. You can't be found faithful in 5 minutes. You ever thought about that? Is he a faithful employee? Well, sure he is. We've had him on the job for 5 minutes, and he hadn't done us any harm yet. You don't know faithfulness until you've seen someone's life lived out over time. And there's really only one way to be faithful. It's a principle that Paul taught in Romans 10:17 with regard to the gospel. You remember Romans 10:17? Faith comes by hearing, and that by the word of God. So if you don't have a word from God, you can't really be faithful. But when God tells you, this is how I want you to live, and you say, okay, I'll live that way, and over time you look at someone's life, even your own life, and you can say, that person has been faithful. But you can't do it without time. It takes time. And with that in mind, look back at the verse. A faithful man will abound with blessings, but he who does what? Who makes haste. Tell me about somebody who makes haste.
They're not real careful about their decisions.
They're not careful about their decisions, for one thing. What do they do not want to do? They do not want to take time. They don't want to wait. They reject the idea of time. Righteous people listen to what God says, and they say, I'm going to do this. Well, how long are you going to do it? Well, I'm going to do it all the time. And how do we find out if someone's faithful? You look at their life over time. You can't look at their life over 5 minutes or an hour or a week. If you want to find out if somebody's going to be faithful, you have to look at their life over time. But somebody who said, I don't want to take the time, I want to be rich now. What's he say about that guy? You can read it. It's okay. Chapter 28, verse 20. He will not go unpunished. And sometimes the punishment is just the results of our own hurrying, our own haste. What did Benjamin Franklin say about haste? It makes waste. And sometimes, I've done it. Probably everybody else has done something like this. I'm building a wood project, and I'm kind of in a hurry, and so I make the measurement, I make the mark, I make the cut, take it over there, and it's too short. Why didn't I do what?
Remeasure.
Measure twice. What's the old saying?
Measure twice, cut once.
There you go. But it's right. I'm not going to check it. And boom, you got a board that's too short. You can cut it off as many times as you want, but it's still going to be too short. Kay, and then Mike. You did have your hand up, didn't you?
I did.
Okay.
Yes. I'm hearing echoes of, we hear lots of comments now about the entitlement generation.
Yes?
They're entitled to this and that and this, and it's my right to have this and that. But they haven't been taught the value of delayed gratification,
Yes, that's true.
which is the root of faithfulness.
I agree. Delayed gratification, waiting for the outcome of whatever good thing you're doing. Talking about the entitlement generation, I think it was Newt Gingrich was in an interview, and somebody said, asked him about, you expect these kids to work at McDonald's? And he said, well, some people see that as a job that's got no end. I say a job at McDonald's as an opportunity.
That's right.
Well, yeah, that's right.
It's a starting point.
Wherever you start,
You learn.
you can show yourself to be, what are we talking about? Faithful over the long term. If you've got a manager and that kid's, he's just 15 or 16, but well, maybe you can't work at 15, I don't know. But he's here on time every day. He's clean and ready to go every day. He commits himself to his job every day. He's not standing around idle. He's not messing around goofing off. He takes care of something every day. He's the best employee I've got. What's he going to do with that kid? He's going to promote him or give him a raise or any benefit that he has to offer that young man or that young woman. That's what he's going to do because it's an opportunity. And that's really what we're looking at in here. All of God's physical blessings are opportunities for us to have joy and pleasure, and even a small job that might seem like it's dead end is something that is an opportunity for good. Mike, and then Dayton.
Well, this translation says that one eager to get rich will not go unpunished. That kind of, the picture I get from that is like a child that gets a toy that must be assembled, and in their eagerness to have their toy, they don't read the instructions. As a result, they wind up with a mess instead of the toy that they were going for.
That's right. Any of you ever put together model airplanes or model cars? Or kids don't do that so much anymore. That used to be a big deal when I was a kid, and you definitely better read the instructions before you put the glue on the plastic. Dayton.
The statement that a faithful man will abound in blessings implies a progressive development of blessings which demands that my faithfulness continue to grow and strengthen in regard to principles, procedures, whatever is necessary in order to properly handle an expanding amount. Like the man that got 5, he went up to 10.
That's right.
And if I do not keep growing, then I'm in danger that my blessings may become a curse. I think America is today in the process of attaining, of being prospered and not able to handle it well.
I think that's a good point.
In fact, that's happened nation after nation.
It's a principle. Nick?
That's what it goes along with your, to be tested as faithful is time.
Yes.
And as an older person will tell any younger person, you know, the things you want now are not what are important in life, as I now know through my life.
Right.
So the things that are in perspective as you've lived and the things that I tell my children that they want now that are not really that important to them are, you know, it's time. It's all things are in perspective, and you know, good things are those who wait, and the good things that we think that we're waiting for are not really the good things that we're waiting for, the things that we can't even fathom.
That's so true. And how many of us have found that we look at life and we think, man, I wish I'd have known this back when. Yeah, but you can't backtrack. All you can do is learn and make application of what you learn to today and tomorrow. See, that was 28:20, so let's go to, I think I might have gotten some things out, but it's the same stuff. 22:4, let's just go there. Need a reader. Let's not waste time, 22:4. Read it, make sure you can pronounce the words, then raise your hand.
A man with an evil eye hastens after wealth.
Ah, a man with an evil eye does what?
Hastens after wealth.
All right.
And does not know that want will come upon him.
Now that's,
No.
No, that's
Something we have.
yes, Proverbs 22:4. I'm glad you read that though, because,
I'm sorry, 28, 22.
okay. It's in context. 22:4.
The reward of humility and the fear of the Lord are riches, honor, and
Who doesn't want that? How do you get riches, honor, and life?
Through humility.
humility.
Through humility and fear of the Lord. Now, hold on a minute. Just put this in perspective and in all actual living out circumstances. If you humble yourself before God, what is God going to do? He's going to give you something to do. Are you going to do it or not? That's the question. If you don't do it, you're really not humble. If you don't do it, you really don't fear the Lord. But if God says, here's what I want you to do this. And I'm not talking about moving mountains necessarily. I'm talking about if you're 10 years old, it's obey your parents, honor your parents. And as much as this is right, honor your parents. That's what you have to do. You going to do that as a 10-year-old or not? You're 15 years old. What are you supposed to do? Go to school, do your homework, make your bed, mow the yard, whatever it is you're supposed to do as a 15-year-old. Well, I don't want to do that because I'm a 15. Well, that doesn't matter. You're either going to honor God or you're not. You're going to be faithful or you're not. You want riches? You want honor? You want the things that Solomon's talking about here? You got to be faithful. You got to fear the Lord. You're 25. You get married. What's God say? Treat your wife or your husband this way. Treat your husband like you would treat the Lord, if like the church would treat the Lord. Treat your wife like the Lord treats the church. You going to do that or not? Or are you going to be selfish with your marriage? You got children. What are you going to do with your children? I'm going to let them run wild because I don't want to discipline them. Besides, people will say bad things about me if I strike my children. God will strike your children someday, and he will strike you if you do not strike your children. I'm not talking about beating on your kids. I'm talking about loving, corrective discipline. What are we going to do? Are we going to be faithful? Or are we going to say, I won't do that? So I don't want anybody to read this verse and think, all I have to do is sit down and be nice. Well, no. If you humble yourself before the Lord, if you truly fear him, he's going to give you things to do. And in all of his doing, in all of your doing of what he gives you to do, there's going to be reward. There's going to be honor. There's going to be life. But you can't be faithful if you're not doing. Dave?
1 Peter 5:7 says, all of you gird yourselves with humility, but then act to serve
That's right.
one another, for God resists the proud, but he gives his grace to the humble. So out of the humbleness here, you get riches and honor and life. And that's God's grace.
That's his grace. That's the way he works it. So who's greatest in the kingdom? That's the question the apostles had. And what did Jesus tell them? The one who is servant of all. God always looks for the one who is submitting themselves to him. And when he finds those who are submitting, putting themselves under his guidance, he exalts them. He did it with Jesus, and he does it with everyone. You submit yourself to him, he'll put you on high. You put yourself on high. Remember the parable Jesus taught about you go into the feast and, man, there's a seat up there next to the guest of honor. Hey, that's for me. What happens if you sit up there? The master of the feast is going to come in and say, hey, this ain't your place, bud. You need to go back down there. Is that going to be a little embarrassing? But if you come in and you take the lowest seat, and the master of the feast comes out, wait, what are you doing? Sit down. You're supposed to be up here. And even if it's just 2 chairs up, you have been honored. You have been exalted to some extent. And so God is saying, and you're probably looking at verse 4 in chapter 22 and saying, where are you getting all that junk, Marty? Well, I think it's in there.
Again, you have Solomon here writing this, and when he was young and became old, he had his humility, and God did reward him abundantly for it, and then his prosperity did him in, as he later failed to have really a good life toward the end.
Well, you talk about an organic illustration. It's right here. That's it. All right, 21:5. Don't think we've covered that one yet. We'll just back up a little bit here. Somebody read that for us. 21:5.
Plans of the diligent lead surely to plenty, but those of everyone who is hasty surely to poverty.
Are we back to anything we've already discussed? What is required to show yourself diligent? Another trick question. Time. You can't show yourself diligent without time. The plans. Now, what's implied with plans?
You've got a plan, you've got a direction to go.
You're thinking about the future. That's what's implied. You're not just bopping along from one day to the next. Oh, I don't know what I'm going to do today. Oh, no, you got to have a plan. Have a plan. There's nothing wrong with having plans. Now, Proverbs 16:9 says, the mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. But he's still teaching us to have a plan. Nowhere does God say, hey, don't plan anything. Don't look to the future. I'll take care of all that. No. He says, make your plans. But when you make your plans, remember, you got to be diligent. You got to stick with it. And those plans that you're diligent with lead to advantage. But if you are, and here's the contrast again, what happens? How do you come to poverty according to this? You're hasty. You get in a hurry. Don't get in a hurry. Don't get in a hurry. How many of you like to eat ribs? Can you fix them in a microwave? There's really only one proper way to cook ribs, and it takes about 24 hours. And I've got to change the subject. Yes?
I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean if someone goes broke, that they weren't faithful.
Yes, that's true.
You know, and sometimes people are faithful, and bad things happen to good people sometimes. And faithfulness, sometimes people are faithful. John the Baptist was faithful, got his head chopped off for it.
Right.
You know, I mean, sometimes those, things happen. This Proverbs, we got to keep it in perspective in the sense of.
Excellent point.
Yes, obviously, if we're not prudent, bad things can happen physically on this earth. There's a lot of times we're talking about spiritual things too. Sometimes some parts poor people are happier people than the guy that's got a lot of wealth, worrying about how to keep it, what to do, and all this other stuff.
Right.
Sometimes it's just an attitude.
And I'm glad you brought that up. And just as we're getting ready to close here, go to Hebrews chapter 11. And I want to make a point here, or maybe add to the point that Don is making would be a better way to say it. Hebrews chapter 11 is a marvelous passage that the writer of this book provides to show what we were talking about earlier, this long-term idea of faithfulness, people who've been faithful, and they've been faithful because of what they've done. And then he gets down in the latter part of chapter 11 to talk about some of the results of their faithfulness because the world has rejected them for it. Look at verse 32. What more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, and Samuel, and the prophets who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their release so that they might obtain a better resurrection. So you're seeing in this some great victories, but also things that we would say, oh my, that's horrible. Why did that happen to them? But it's all based on faith. Others experienced, this is verse 36, others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword, they went about in sheepskins, in goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. All these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. In other words, tying all this together and making a practical application, just because you make it a point to spank your child doesn't mean they're going to turn out perfect. Just because you make plans and are attentive to the physical blessings God's given you doesn't mean that adversity and finances might sometimes come your way. Proverbs, remember we talked about this in the beginning of class, are general truths. And when God gives us these general truths, it says this is generally how life is going to work. And I'm going to work with you to make it this way. There are exceptions. One of the best would be Jesus. Did anybody live a more perfect life than Jesus? And how did he die? He was persecuted to death. So that's how the world is in conflict with the ways of God. But if it weren't for the world, if it weren't for sin, everyone who lived righteously would prosper. But this is a battle. Hope everybody is seeing it like that. This is a fight. And this is the best way to get into the fight. When you become a member of this nation's military, they do their best to train you how to go about waging war, because that's really what the military is all about. We wouldn't have the military if there wasn't a threat of war. But do any soldiers or airmen, any Marines, any sailors who are doing their job perfectly ever get killed in war? Yes, they do. And so we put our lives on the line with God every day. We say, Lord, I'm yours. Let me live in your kingdom. Let me live for your honor. Let me live for your glory. And it may be that we, like some of those in Hebrews 11, will be called upon to live in a cave, or to walk around in a goat skin, or to be persecuted. Have you been reading the news? I mean, it was recently in the news, and they've said this isn't going to happen, but it was recently in the news, the question of whether Christians would be court-martialed from the military for sharing their faith with fellow members of the military. The question came up, and they said, no, we're not going to do that. But the very idea that the question would come up. Have you seen the news about Chris Broussard? You know who Chris Broussard is? He's a writer for ESPN, sports writer. They were interviewing him, and they asked him about this guy. I can't remember the guy's name that came out, said he was gay, which is interesting. Guy comes out and says he's gay, and he gets a call from the president. I don't think he ever called Tim Tebow. Not a political commentary, but we're talking about the ways of the world. If you go with the world, you're going to get the glory in the world. But if you go with God, you might have to wait for your glory. Is that okay? The glory of the world won't last, but God's glory will. But I'm just saying, we'll talk about this a little in the sermon, but things are changing, and they might not be changing so much in favor for the Lord's people. So stay faithful. Bill?
Marty, my granddad Farmer was born and raised in a Choctaw reservation, and he was at home out in the woods. And he was talking about sassafras roots. He showed me the tree, and he says the red roots are pink, orange. They're the ones that make sassafras tea. The white one's poison. That's part of my heritage. I thought everybody ought to know.
So before you dig up your sassafras, talk to Bill. Judy?
Well, I just wanted to say, we focused on prosperity, but sometimes prosperity does not mean riches.
Yes, that's right. There are many different ways to prosper, and some of those other ways are a whole lot better than money. So, very good point. Thank you all for your time and your attention this morning. Class is dismissed.